Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Patty Koval with the Virginia Funders Network. I'm the Director of Member Networking and Learning. And I wanted to just say how glad I am that y'all are able to join us. We'll have some other people coming in shortly, but we'd like to just make sure we get plenty of time for our very capable group of panelists to be able to talk with us today about homelessness to housing. So I'm going to turn it over now to Susan Hallett for her to make some introductions and get us started.
Thank you, Patty. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Susan Hallett. I work with the Bob and Anna Lou Shaberg Foundation, and I am co-chair of the Virginia Funders Network's Housing Networking Group. And we are so pleased that you could join us for this learning session focused on homelessness to housing. Today, we're going to discuss the current state of homelessness in Virginia, the impact of COVID on homelessness, and innovative solutions to addressing homelessness through permanent housing. We are very lucky to have wonderful speakers with us today. There we go. Allison Bogdanovic is Executive Director of Virginia Supportive Housing, which is Virginia's largest supportive housing provider. We have Fred Karnas, who is Senior Fellow with the Richmond Memorial Health Foundation and also Senior Policy Advisor for the U.S. Department of Treasury. We have Kelly King Horne, who is Executive Director of Homeward, which is the planning and coordinating body for homeless services in the greater Richmond region. And we have Pam Kessner, Chief Deputy, Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. We're going to begin our session today with some context setting from Fred and Pam, who will share an overview of the homeless services system and a review of the current state of homelessness in Virginia, respectively. Following this, Fred will moderate a panel discussion with all of our speakers to discuss critical issues impacting homelessness today. We will have time for questions and answers at the end of our session. If you have questions along the way, please include them in the chat box. And my co-chair, Caroline Norrie, is going to be monitoring the chat box and collecting your questions for the Q&A portion as we go. And then you're also certainly welcome to speak up at the end of this session if you've got questions that you have not included in the chat. Now I'm going to turn it over to Fred Karnas. Fred has a rich history of working in homeless services and housing, including serving as senior advisor to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development at Secretary Sean Donovan under President Obama. So Fred knows his stuff, and Fred's going to give us an introduction to the homeless services system. And Fred, I'm going to go ahead and let's see, share your slides.
Great. So hello, everyone. Glad to be on the call with you all on a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and particularly a topic that I enjoy connecting philanthropy to. So in the next few minutes, I'm just going to try to quickly run through a look at what the Continuum of Care is and how the Homeless Services Network works, and then turn it over to my colleagues who are deeply involved in this on a day-to-day basis. So I want to start, I think, by giving a historical context, because I think it helps make sense of where the continuum came from and why it's important. Most of you know that modern homelessness began in the late 1970s in places like New York City and San Francisco. And I have to say, in the early days, those of us who were working on homelessness never imagined we'd still be talking about it in 2021. And the first thing that happened was we recognized that it was sort of a different population. Many times it was younger folks who were on the street than we had seen before, but it was predominantly males in the late 70s and early 80s. And the private response system that had existed for years, the Salvation Armies and the rescue missions and the St. Vincent de Paul's, just were overwhelmed by these new numbers that came aboard. And slowly but surely, the public system began to respond. Cities in some places began to create responses. I worked, one of the first things I did was work with the mayor of Phoenix to staff his blue ribbon panel to look at how the public sector could address homelessness in 1983. And it was soon after that the first federal response happened, and that was with FEMA, surprisingly, and it's still a program at FEMA, the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, which was focused primarily on providing shelter funding in those days. It wasn't until 1987 that the first major federal response took place, and that was the passage of the McKinney Act, thanks to a lot of advocacy on behalf of homeless people by people like Mitch Snyder and Michael Stoops. And later that became the McKinney-Vento Act, as Bruce Vento, a congressman who was from Minnesota, who was very supportive of efforts around homelessness, name was added to that after his passing. One of the things that emerged after that, and you can change the slide, Susan, one of the things that emerged from those early days was this, the issue of who is homeless. Once the McKinney Act was passed, people had to figure out who you were going to give those dollars to. And so it began what is, and Kelly knows as well, a decades-long debate about who is homeless. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time about going through the definition other than to say, you can go to the HUD webpage and see what HUD's definition is. I think it's important to recognize that different federal agencies identify who's homeless in different ways. The Department of Education has a much broader definition of homelessness than HUD does. And I would argue that the HUD definition is much more of an operational definition, saying we've got X amount of money, who are we going to narrow this population down to serve? I think from the standpoint of those of you in philanthropy, it's less important to really get deep into the weeds around the definition than it is to understand who's being served and who isn't. The reality is that homelessness is a very gray area, and people move in and out of homelessness on a regular basis. A lot of people are able to, on their own, solve their homelessness, and a lot of people spend their lifetime sort of moving in and out of homelessness. And I think it's more important just to sort of see in your community who's not being served because the resources are targeting other folks, and perhaps plug in there. Again, my point is not to perseverate over the definition, but to look at the populations that may not be served. We can move to the next slide. In the early years of the McKinney Act, one of the things that happened was you applied directly to HUD. If you wanted transitional housing, you sent an application to HUD. If you wanted to do a safe haven or an SRO, you applied it directly to HUD. And the result was there was no coordination at the community level. There was a lot of fragmentation in where the services went. Two organizations within a block of each other could send in good applications and get funded. HUD didn't pay attention to where they were. They just funded good programs. The other thing that happened is the rich got richer. Places like Boston and New York and San Francisco and Portland and Seattle, all of whom had been working on homelessness for a decade, had systems in place. And so they were able to put in good applications and get a big chunk of the money. And so in 1994, the Continuum of Care was designed to sort of address this issue. One was to level the playing field, to make sure that every county in the country had access to some dollars. And so there was literally, using the CDBG formula in the early days, dollars were assigned to every county in the country. And you could get those dollars if you submitted a Continuum of Care plan. And over the years, that's changed somewhat. The continuums look very different in some cases, like New York City and Washington, DC, they're a single city. In Los Angeles County, it's 88 cities that put a Continuum of Care in, or make up the Continuum of Care and put an application together. The other important aspect of the continuum was to involve community stakeholders, not just providers, but to bring in the faith community, to bring in homeless people themselves, to bring in the business community, to be at the table to address what's a community-wide problem. Doesn't belong to one sector. And to incent collaboration, to look at ways that you could understand what each other is doing, work on each other's strengths in terms of providers, and then to encourage promising practices, which have changed over the years pretty dramatically. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But in the early days, HUD identified sort of 3 areas that you're supposed to focus on. And over the years, as I said, that's changed a good bit. The goal was to create a plan that looked at how you might solve homelessness in your community, and then carve out of that what you could use the HUD dollars to help, and then to use other funds to try to address other pieces of the problem. You can switch to the slide. So today, there are over 400 continuums of care across the country. And like I said, they vary from one that covers almost entirely the state of Nebraska, to the one in Los Angeles that I mentioned that has 88 individual cities, to places that have just a single jurisdiction. I think that, as I said, there are lots of big and small changes have taken place in how the Continuum of Care operates over the years. What funding can be used for, no longer transitional housing. For example, no longer are there safe havens, for example. Different populations were prioritized. In the early 2000s, the focus began to be on chronically homeless individuals and veterans. We, as I said, eliminated approaches that didn't show real success, and refocused on housing rather than services. I have to admit that during my days running the homeless programs at HUD in Washington in the late 90s, 60% of all the HUD money went to services, which should have been provided by HHS. And so we've tightened that up over the years. And we've tightened up the governing restrictions for the structures for continuums of care. And Kelly can tell you more about that, but really making sure that it really is run in a way that's representative of various groups in the community. There still remain a lot of challenges as we go forward, and we may talk about that as a little bit more as we go through the day, but there are limited resources for new endeavors. In the early years, we had a lot of money, and that was a real incentive for people to collaborate and come on board. Today, most of the money goes to just renewing grants from previous years, and you get a little bit new money each year, and it's tough to get new projects up and running. We still have a struggle with how to serve all populations. While it's loosened up a good bit around families and youth and older adults, it's still very much focused on vulnerable populations, particularly chronically homeless folks and veterans. And then I would argue that the funding for the planning itself, collaboration is hard work. It's costly work. You need people that can devote their time to this and aren't doing 4 other chores. And so resources for the continuums themselves, groups like Homeward here in the Continuum of Care in Richmond, but others across the state. So just in closing, I would just say that philanthropy can help with all of those challenges. There's opportunities to plug in. One of the things that's really helpful is flexible dollars that can tie programs together, that can help fund collaborators, people that can, like I said earlier, can focus on activities that may not be possible with the current staff. So there are just lots of ways, I think, for philanthropy to engage, and hopefully we'll touch on some of those as we go forward. But hopefully that gives you a very quick and dirty summary of what the continuum of care looks like and what the homeless services structure looks like. So I will stop there and turn it over to Pam.
Thank you, Fred. Our next speaker, we are really so honored to have Pam Kessner with us again, who is Chief Deputy for the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. And Pam, like Fred, has a very rich history in homeless services and housing issues. So we're thrilled to have her with us today. And Pam, I'm going to go ahead and pop up your PowerPoint and turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Susan. And thanks, Fred. That was a great foundation to provide this conversation. I'm really happy to be part of the panel today. I've worked with several of the folks on the panel in the past and currently as well. And really am happy to be here to talk about what we're doing at the state level. But it's always in partnership with our community partners like Kelly and like Allison, and then state partners. We have also state agencies I'll be talking about, but other partners as well. So great to be with you. So the first slide is really, the next slide, please, is just a little bit about the Department of Housing and Community Development. We are the state agency that focuses on safe, affordable, and prosperous communities, which includes ensuring that we have affordable housing for all people living in Virginia. And of course, like many states around the country, Virginia is struggling right now to create more affordable housing, but we've made some strides
and have some other opportunities that we'll talk about later in the session. But DHCD does serve in the role of focusing on housing, and addressing homelessness is a key component of housing. Of course, people experiencing homelessness is a situation that they have found themselves in for a variety of reasons. And so some of the solutions to addressing or ending homelessness really are working across organizations, state agencies, and sectors. Next slide, please. Virginia, we've been very fortunate over the past 10 years, actually, to get some national attention about how well we have moved the needle in reducing overall homelessness. We were the first state in the nation to functionally end veteran homelessness several years ago. The pandemic has, of course, had a negative impact on our ability to move people from homelessness to housing. But we also have more resources coming into our state than ever before. We'll talk about a little bit later. But one of the reasons why Virginia has been so successful in moving the needle is that we've aligned much of our work with what's happening at the federal level through HUD, as what Fred was sharing, but also there's the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness that helps guide promising practices and develops a strategic plan on how to effectively end homelessness. And Virginia, we have been very strategic and intentional in aligning our work with the work at the federal level, and then in turn working with the Continuum of Care organizations and local planning groups across the state, once again to align the work. So it's local, regional, state, and federal. Back in 2010, then Governor Bob McDonnell created an advisory committee to look at creating some outcomes addressing to effectively address homelessness. And a plan was created, and both Kelly and I were members of that initial advisory committee. DHCD was provided the staff support, but it was an interagency, intersecretariat effort to identify what we needed to do in Virginia to effectively move the needle. And so next slide, actually, we identified that, first of all, we need to look at the data so we can make informed policy decisions on what really does create the outcomes that we're looking for. And one of those best practices, promising practices that had been in place, of course, for a while, but we really embraced it, and that's a housing first approach, rapid rehousing, really focusing on getting people rehoused as quickly as possible. The sooner they are rehoused, the more quickly they can address some of the challenges that brought them into homelessness in the beginning. Also a focus on permanent supportive housing, which I believe Allison will be sharing a lot about. Virginia supportive housing as a leader, not only in Virginia, but in the country, in the way they have created more PSH to assist people experiencing homelessness that have chronic health or behavioral health issues. And lastly, DHCD created a community application process. Fred mentioned that the COCs really are all about identifying or creating a collaborative, a coordinated effort to address homelessness. And DHCD reinforces that approach by having the COCs submit applications for funding so that the community determines how best to spend the resources, as long as they meet basic eligibility through DHCD and the federal resources. We want to support our partners in doing that. Next slide. Providing two slides here on our reduction in homelessness. So since 2010, as I mentioned, you'll see that big dip that occurred between 2010 and 2014. That was a huge shift of resources, as well as, again, being very strategic and shifting people to rapid rehousing. So over the past 10 years, 34% decrease. There was a bit of an uptick in 2020, but you'll see on the next slide in 2021, a bit of a downtick. So we gather this information with the annual point in time count. I'm not sure if Kelly's going to talk about that, but that is our way of basically tracking our success around the reduction of homelessness. One of the things about the 2021 data, just to point out that the point in time count was taken during the pandemic, so it has impacted some of the numbers. And then also, these are preliminary numbers. We submit our numbers to HUD and they haven't validated them yet, but we're pretty sure they're pretty close. Next slide. So we've been very successful in reducing overall homelessness by 34% over the past 10 years. And we've done so again by making data driven decisions and identifying ways to provide resources. And in Virginia, we have about $15.4 million in state and federal dollars that we issue through our Virginia Homeless Solutions program. I've listed some of the eligible activities there. I'm not going to go through each one, but several of those Fred pointed out in his description of what the COCs do at the local level, and through the Virginia Homeless Solutions program, this is how we can help support the efforts at the local level. I do want to point out that we do help fund planning, which we think is really critical to develop overall goals so that the community knows that everyone's pulling in the same direction, and then to actually track your metrics to ensure you're having the expected outcomes that you were hoping to get. Next slide. Another important source of funds is the State Housing Trust Fund. Virginia has been very fortunate over the past couple of years where Governor Northam in the General Assembly has given a humongous boost to the trust fund. I guess it was back in 2017, we were actually at about 7 million. That's $7 million for an entire state. And this year in 2020, our fiscal year 2022, we are at 55 million. And the significant increase in funds has a lot to do with the need to create more affordable housing, to create more permanent supportive housing. And through the Housing Trust Fund, we can spend up to 20% of that 55 million on homeless reduction grants, about $8.3 million this year. And these are the eligible activities, very similar to the other grant program. One thing that I did want to point out in this year's grant application, we are focused on underserved populations. And if you'll go to the next slide, it describes a bit more about the Underserved Population Innovation Project. We want communities to identify what their priorities are. Just because youth homelessness might be something that's significant in the Virginia Beach area, in Roanoke, it very well could be more focused. They're seeing more older adults experiencing homelessness. So we wanted to give some additional funds for communities to address particular needs of certain populations. And those are listed there on that slide. Next slide. Early in Governor Northam's administration, he did issue an executive order that focuses on increasing the supply of permanent supportive housing, reducing the rate of evictions across the Commonwealth. Virginia, unfortunately, has 5 of the 10 top evicting communities in the nation, as reported by Matthew Desmond, and the Eviction Lab at Princeton, which is something that we're working very diligently on and have made some strong inroads to addressing that. And then, of course, the overall shortage of affordable quality housing. But as it relates to permanent supportive housing, that has really enabled us, with the governor's support and the General Assembly, to target more resources to creating more units. In order to do that, we've had to work across state agencies, as I mentioned. If you'll go to the next slide, it is a graphic that basically shows some of the populations that we are collectively at the state level focused on in our efforts to create more permanent supportive housing. So I mentioned the Governor's Coordinating Council on Homelessness, which began around 2012. Kelly is a member of that, as well as Allison. Then about the same time the Coordinating Council got off the ground, the Department of Justice entered into a settlement with the Commonwealth of Virginia to requiring Virginia to create more housing options for people with intellectual developmental disabilities. And then on the heels of that, about 4 years ago, the General Assembly tasked the Department of Housing and Community Development to create more permanent supportive housing for people with serious mental illness. So we have aligned all of those special populations and working as one group. We have a steering committee that is overseen by an interagency leadership team that's comprised of all of the agency heads of the state agencies, and there are 8 of them, both on the Health and Human Resources Secretariat as well as under Commerce and Trade Secretariat, which is where DHCD is located. But that alignment has allowed us to coordinate not only our efforts, but to pool our resources. And we've worked really closely with Virginia Housing, which is the state finance agency for housing, to create more low-income housing tax credits for developers to use when they create supportive housing and create units that are designated for populations with special needs. So next slide, I think that's it. Just all in all, the overall success we've had to date in moving the needle with homelessness has been collaboration and partnerships. And I know we'll be getting into more discussions about specific partnerships later. So I will now turn it back. And I think it's,
Thanks.
sorry.
No, you're good. Thank you so much, Pam. That was great information. I really appreciate you and Fred helping to set the stage. Homelessness is a complicated issue, and we knew it would be helpful for everyone to have a little level setting before we jumped into our discussion. So at this point, we are going to have, Fred is going to moderate a panel discussion with Pam and Allison and Kelly. Just as a reminder, please go ahead and put your questions in the chat, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end of our session. Fred, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to kick us off.
Great. Well, thank you. And I'm going to ask a question of Pam here in a second, but I can't let something she said go when she mentioned the eviction issues in Virginia. I have to say that, yeah, when Matthew Desmond wrote the book, Virginia didn't fare very well. But in my day job, while I'm on leave of absence from the foundation, working at Treasury, helping sort of lead the emergency rental assistance program, I have the opportunity every Tuesday to sit with a group at the White House to hear from Matthew Desmond's lab, and I am very proud every week when they mention that Virginia is doing better than any other state, and that's thanks to Pam's team. So the eviction rate in this state is significantly lower than any other state in the country right now, and it wouldn't be happening without Pam and her folks. So let me move to that to ask Pam a question about you know, I alluded to this a little bit, but you can dig in a little bit deeper. How has the approach to addressing homelessness evolved over the last decade or two?
Yeah, happy to answer that, Fred. But first, thank you for the shout out. Very, very proud of where we stand in as it relates to keeping people housed during the pandemic. But if we haven't done it alone. It's really taken advocates both on the tenants and the landlord side and local partners. So thank you for that. You know, the approach to addressing homelessness back in the 90s and early 2000s, before I arrived at DHCD, but much of the funding was focused on the emergency shelter system. It's very important to have an emergency shelter system, a safety net, if you will. But the way organization shelters were funded were based on the number of beds that they have and filled beds. So there wasn't much incentive to moving people out of the shelters into housing. Not that they purposefully kept them there, but it was important that they be able to share the, you know, demonstrate a need for more money. So some of the shift that we have had has been around let's focus on getting people housed and having a plan on how do you move from experiencing homelessness to getting into permanent housing. Another approach that has evolved over time, organizations developed plans that were based on how the organization functioned. So for example, if a family was moved into transitional housing, once they left an emergency shelter, they would go into transitional housing, and a plan was created that basically was about 18 months to 2 years. And it would say, you know, this is how we're going to get you into permanent housing by the end of the 18-month or 2-year period of time. And they worked at that pace. Whereas now the approach is it's client or family individual centered, where it's based on what do their needs dictate as to how long it's going to take for them to get into permanent housing. So in many cases, it just takes 3 to 6 months to get into permanent housing. And, you know, no fault of the organizations, but that was basically the approach that was being used over the course of time. So, yeah, that's it in a nutshell. There could be others. Kelly certainly has been working in this space at the local level and has experienced watching her partners addressing homelessness over a long period of time.
Yeah, I wanted to bring Kelly in on this because you've been doing this for a while. Just what you've seen in the time you've been in this field.
You know, what I think is probably of most interest, especially thinking about a connection to philanthropy. So first, I'm Kelly King Horne with Homeward in the Richmond region, is that we have gone from being a really sort of, well, feel good helpers, like we help people look, you know, like a lot of focus on just very sort of fluffy stories around homelessness, you know, and providing opportunities for the community to come in and put together a backpack or cook a meal. And the biggest shift has been to take a really, a much more systems approach and really diving into complex human and social service issues and really, you know, focusing on the need and really, you know, serving, you know, we prioritize serving the hardest to serve and bringing in other systems of care. So the work has become, I think, more complex and really is about changing the response. So not just doing things that are helpful, but actually doing things that quite honestly are hard. And I think seeing, and that change being supported by federal policy, by funding, and by programs. I mean, that to me is the biggest shift. And so I've been with Homeward for 18 years, and that shift towards doing difficult things because it's moving the needle, I think that's the single biggest change.
Allison, certainly the supportive housing world has changed over the last 2 decades or so since it sort of emerged. You know, maybe you could talk a little bit about what you've seen and in that world.
Absolutely. And supportive housing is a terminology that we use that's basically apartments that people experiencing homelessness move into, and they can stay as long as they need to. They're called permanent because they are lease-based, usually an annual lease, and there's not a time limit for how long they can stay. And they're layered in with supportive services more than you would typically see in an apartment community to help help folks meet whatever goals they have and help keep them housed. We would say most likely without those wraparound services, folks most likely would not be successful in a traditional apartment community. But one of the things that I wanted to share that has changed, and I think 30 years ago when supportive housing was sort of getting its sea legs, and that's when Virginia supportive housing began in Virginia, and it was considered very experimental. It was the idea that services can be voluntary or should be voluntary, that you don't require or mandate a meeting with a case manager, or say if you don't stick to your plan, then you're going to lose your housing, because we found that mandating services is very ineffective. It has to be very client-centered, as Pam said, and driven by their choice. We also, and now we actually call it housing first. And that's sort of a phrase that you may hear in the homelessness services community, because housing first means it's very, very low barrier. We don't put up a lot of, you have to do this if you want to get into housing. We try to make it so that if someone experiencing homeless comes in, there's as few obstacles in their way, because we want to meet their most basic needs first. Where are they going to sleep that night? Where are they going to get food? We say it's meeting in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the most basic human needs first. And then, and only then, when they develop trust and a sense of safety, can they start to say, hey, you know what? My feet hurt. I need to see a doctor, or I haven't seen a dentist in a long time. And they start to address their physical health needs and hopefully other mental health and behavioral health issues as well. So voluntary services, and that can be a real challenge for some partners and funders who say, so you're going to give someone an apartment, and you're not going to require anything of them. But let me just share with you, it may look like that, but it's the way that it works. And I will add that folks do pay a portion of their income. And even if they pay $0, they're still paying $50. Even if they make $0 in income, they're still paying about $50 a month. As folks get benefits, entitlements, that usually goes up. So our average resident is paying about $250 a month for their rent. So not completely free.
Thank you, Allison. And I think you make a good point that I think we've learned over these 30 years that there's much greater success when people have that level of choice. So the investment of maybe giving somebody some time to get back on their feet again actually has much more of an impact than sort of forcing them into some sort of plan. And I would just say, I was going to say this on my last slide because there was a picture of supportive housing there, that in the end, it's housing that ends homelessness. It may not end mental illness, it may not end a lot of other things, but it ends homelessness. And then you can work on those other things, as Allison pointed out. I want to stay with you, Allison, and ask, because your organization works in different parts of the state, could you talk a little bit about how homelessness looks different in different parts of Virginia?
Absolutely. So we were founded here in Richmond, but we've had the pleasure of working, and I know I saw Linda on the call. So we're down in Southampton Roads, and then we are as far west as Charlottesville. So we hit 2 of the major population centers in Virginia, but not Northern Virginia. But, you know, when I think of the homelessness needs across the state. It's the similarity is what you just said, Fred. There is a huge need for affordable housing. Housing ends homelessness, whether you're down in Norfolk or you're here or you're in Richmond or you're in Charlottesville, there's not enough supply of affordable housing. And that's for incomes of people making $10,000 a year to $40,000 a year. So that's a theme everywhere. The other theme that is the same is all communities are using very similar funding. The HUD funding, the federal funding that Fred, that you talked about, the state funding that Pam assists with, all the communities are working pretty much with the same funding mix. How they choose to spend those funds, the priorities that they use and the local funds that they add to it, that may differ. So differences it can look different depending on how dense the population is. In less dense parts of the state, you see more homeless people living in cars and maybe in parking lots. So you see that. And we also see in some parts of the state overcrowding. So folks living way too many folks in either a mobile home or a really small apartment or house. So those things are different. But then there's also local priorities. As was mentioned earlier, sometimes there's a larger population of homeless youth and a will to address that. And so you will see federal and state funds deployed with local priorities, and then you'll see local philanthropy helping to supplement that. I will also add that there's differences in regional collaboration because most of our communities, homelessness doesn't end at a city or a county line. It's a regional issue, and folks are moving throughout a region in the state usually. And so I'll just highlight Southampton Roads, where we've been, working for almost 20 years. We have 5 cities in that region who all said we're going to work together and end chronic homelessness. They put their local political power and their resources behind that mission, and created a lot of supportive housing for that. And so folks, I think there's like a maturity level. There's this of folks willing to share their resources and not consider it just this city's problem. And and if they're going to be more successful, they're going to collaborate more as a region.
Great, that's great. Pam, you obviously, your folks work all over the state. One of the things that strikes me that's is, having worked in Arizona for a long time, is the invisibility of homelessness in rural areas. I wondered if you had any thoughts about how you address that. A lot of it's, as Allison said, doubling up and that sort of thing, but other things that may happen in rural Virginia that you all are trying to address.
Yes, Fred, you're exactly right. It is more invisible in rural areas. In urban areas, you see folks more congregating outside in different areas. In rural areas, people are more spread out. One of the things that we do at DHCD, so Fred talked about the continuum of care. For HUD, HUD identifies specific communities that have a certain size population where they work directly, provide funds directly to a continuum of care. So in Virginia, there are 16 of them. DHCD serves as the balance of state for the rest of the state. So we are basically a continuum of care. And it's through our work as the balance of state where we provide additional support to more rural areas, small areas. And what we're finding is that, and because there are fewer resources in these communities, because they're not as dense population as Allison was mentioning, rural areas tend to have more collaboration across organizations. They tend to, they're not able to not work together because of the scarce resources. So what we're finding is that there's a lot of creativity. Now, that doesn't mean folks in urban areas aren't creative. Kelly and her her team are very creative and to address emerging needs as well as emergency needs, like what happened during the pandemic. But in rural areas, the challenge is getting people connected to the resources. And we have found in some areas, the school systems are playing a huge role because they can identify families that are unstably housed or who are experiencing homelessness through the teachers, what they're learning. And so there's a lot of coordination through the schools in rural areas.
Thanks. Kelly, I want to talk a little bit about COVID. And I think one of the real successes here in the Richmond area was how the Homeless Services Network and the Continuum of Care and Homeward really stepped forward to address this problem and built partnerships. And I say that sort of in a larger context too. Susan and I have been working with older adult groups, and it comes up all the time. Boy, we wish we had a system, a network, a backbone
Right.
like the Continuum of Care when these kinds of things happen, or when just trying to. And so, just talk a little bit about sort of how it played out here and why the Continuum of Care was important to show that this ongoing collaboration and coordination is really has potential to help in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, no, thank you, Fred. It's, and thinking about, what we've learned during the pandemic, I think the first thing, before I get to the impact of collaboration, it sort of reminded us that while, because this is going to sound contradictory, we do really complex system change work in homeless services through the Continuum of Care and, working with that alignment at local, state, and federal levels. And I'm going to come back to that. But the pandemic sort of stripped everything away and reminded us that emergency shelter is a life-saving intervention, right? And that homelessness is a crisis that can lead to death. Like, it is an urgent crisis. It has always been an urgent crisis, but we forgot that a little bit as a community to just think, okay, this is what we're doing. This is how we help. These are the programs we have. And what we saw during the pandemic was we were reminded of the sense of urgency that people needed to be inside. They needed access to a bathroom. It was just really, we were taken back to the fundamentals, and that with additional funding, we could do it, right? I mean, I think with a huge influx of federal resources, we proved that we could go to scale. And those are important lessons. Like, this is the reason we do this work, and resources matter, right? And so I think those are sort of the framework. And then most tellingly, I think, in homelessness, our rate of COVID exposure among a very vulnerable population has been below the state average. During the entire pandemic, in the Richmond region, we had no known deaths from COVID among people experiencing homelessness or homeless services staff. And that wasn't true across the country. And so, I mean, those are really stark findings, but it was really the fact that we had a 20-year history of, inclusive planning, collaborative decision-making, coordinated services, and the strategic allocation of resources, right? That's what a continuum of care is. The fact that we had that and that it was in place, we could immediately deploy the strategies and programs we needed. And I mean, Annette Cousin serves as our chair. She had the privilege of chairing this collaborative effort during the pandemic. And, we have several of our board members on here. So it was the fact that we had done that hard work. That's what allowed us to be nimble and respond immediately. And so I just think, in thinking about, the shared sense of the problem and the understanding of what it would take to address that problem, right? That's what we had going into it. And then the infrastructure to do that work across agencies, across sectors, across jurisdictions. Those, to me, are recipes for success in almost any field. Thinking about what does it take, what are we trying to do? how will we know if it's working? And then logistically, operationally, how do we make decisions? So to me, when I think about that's how we responded to the pandemic, and that's how we're preparing for what comes next. I think there's, some other things we learned, about housing, the importance of housing for healthcare, how you can, bring together complex systems, but some of the lessons are pretty fundamental, I think. And they're important for philanthropy to understand, because philanthropy helped us develop the muscles that we then used to respond to the pandemic.
Great. Yeah, several things you bring up that come to mind. One is this general comment that you get sometimes is you're throwing money at it, can money really make a difference? From this, we've seen with the resources that have come down, money does make a difference. And another program that haven't talked about at all is the HUD VA program, the HUD program that works with VA. They have had incredible success in reducing the homelessness among veterans, as Pam talked about here in the state. And that's because they've been getting more resources than a lot of the other parts of the homeless program. So as those of you from philanthropy think about this, targeting it, understanding what the best practices are and this sort of thing, but money does make a difference. Allison, I thought maybe you had talked a little bit about the collaboration in Tidewater. Maybe you could just say a little bit more about how that's played out as we think about collaboration as such a key element in all of this.
Absolutely. We also have a very recent example of collaboration in Charlottesville that involves a community foundation that I'd love to mention too. But in Hampton Roads, and Linda is on from the Hampton Roads Community Foundation, that region wanted to end chronic homelessness. They did research as to supportive housing as the national best practice for that. There wasn't a provider in the region. And so they looked at several others in and out of Virginia, and they asked us to come down from Richmond and got behind multiple supportive housing projects. So we created a total of 6 supportive housing communities in the region. And what's really great is all the cities chipped in funding. They provided rental assistance, and they helped with the local zoning battles. and they also made sure that each community has at least one supportive housing community. And so these aren't all just in Norfolk. There's 2 in Norfolk, 2 in Virginia Beach, 1 in Chesapeake, and 1 in Portsmouth. And so you can see that it's really and there's certain numbers of units in each of these communities based on financial contributions to the project. And so you could have a homeless person from Norfolk who goes to live in Chesapeake or in Virginia Beach. They all flow through the buildings. The recent project in Charlottesville is one, it's actually located in Albemarle County, and with the help of the Charlottesville Community Foundation. And when I say help, I mean $5 million, which is a very, very large help, allowed us to buy a local motel. And it wasn't just Virginia Supportive Housing, it's a partnership of 4 nonprofits. And what we're able to do is use this motel as emergency shelter. And so that is being operated by PACHM, the local shelter provider, and organized by TJAC, the Thomas Jefferson Area Coalition for the Homeless, which is Kelly's counterpart there. And then we are working to redevelop and create a new supportive housing building on that site. But folks will be able to stay in the motel units, and we will be able to create our new construction supportive housing and hopefully not displace anybody. They'll be able to move right into the new apartments in a few years. And so we got tax credits for that and are working on our $20 million raise for our apartments. But interesting, number one is that it's in Albemarle County and had to be rezoned. And this was unanimously supported by Albemarle County. That is humongous in terms of the sea change. We did a project in Charlottesville a decade ago, and I would not have believed that Albemarle, we would have a project in Albemarle. And it's really because the community has been focused on dialogues on racism. And they've said housing is how we are going to address this. And there's this foundation of support for a project like this that is phenomenal. And I don't want to leave out the Piedmont Housing Alliance, because they also will be using a portion of this parcel and building some affordable and senior housing on it. And so it's a real partnership that was made possible because the Community Foundation saw the potential of the partnership and the site, which is amazing location, and said, we know we need to get this motel and we know we can't wait. And so they provided the funds. Now, some of that will be paid back and some of it will be granted in the long term, but that's, it's really phenomenal. And last plug on this is, Charlottesville's homelessness problem is not as great as, and when I say that, I mean the whole region, as some of the bigger population centers. And so this project will actually functionally end chronic homelessness in that region. So there will be enough units of housing for everyone. And when someone becomes homeless, the community will have the resources to respond. Their folks won't be on waiting lists for 6 months and 12 months. So it's a great thing to be a part of.
Great, thanks. Two things you mentioned that strike me. Those of us who've spent some years in philanthropy often find ourselves saying, well, remember, philanthropy has more than just money. We can be conveners, we can support activity. And I think as we think about homelessness, this may not be something that philanthropy thinks about as being something that they do as the foundation, but philanthropies often have very strong, powerful community members as board members. And if there's anything we need in many of these communities, as Allison alluded to, is help with NIMBY, help with efforts to get zoning changed. And to the degree that board members can be mobilized on their own, not necessarily responding, not necessarily representing the foundation, to be out there in the community, it's a role that I think philanthropy can really play. The other thing that you mentioned in passing, and we've been remiss to not really focus on this very much, is as we try to address the racial disparities in this country, clearly homelessness is at the top of that list. And so if your foundation is really dialed in on this and really trying to address the disproportionality, homelessness is a place to start. And so I just want to make sure we keep that on the radar screen as we go forward.
And Fred, the other thing that the foundations did in Hampton Roads, the Community Foundation came in big and early on those deals, and they helped give us legitimacy, right? When we were able to show that the Hampton Roads Community Foundation supported our first project to this degree, people sat up and listened, and it was incredibly important. And so, yeah, it was the funds, but there's also sort of a gold standard that really helped.
So I want to keep with you, Allison, and I think everybody here will have something to say on this particular question, but about public-private partnerships. The HUD resources, the FEMA resources, whatever, are not sufficient to meet the need. And so, particularly in the housing world, people have become expert at layering in all kinds of public and private resources. So I'm going to start with you, Allison, but I'll turn to you, Kelly, and to you, Pam, too, to talk a little bit about how public partnerships, whether it's related to housing or other pieces of the puzzle, have been used successfully. It
So, we create supportive housing communities, and a new community is $25 million. And, it takes us 3 to 4 years. And you might say that's a capacity issue, but it's really not. It takes that time because it's about 25 different financing sources. And that's how long it takes, because many of them are sequential. And so we have to go from one application to the next. And those are all public, local, multiple federal, state partnerships. We couldn't do this. We could not be serving folks who make less than $10,000 a year because we're not just talking about a building. We're talking about the operational and supportive services funding to fund this community for at least 15 years. And we wrap that all up at one time because we make sure that it's not going to be such a big annual fundraising lift. On the services side, it's also a partnership, and we're partnering more with health systems to try to help cover some of the costs of the services, because what we see is that folks are inefficiently circling through health systems like emergency rooms, the justice system, and homelessness systems completely inefficiently, inappropriately, and actually wasting money. It's communities will save money when people are in housing and not, using emergency rooms as their primary care, and seeing the local police every other weekend. And so it is a lot of system work, and Kelly mentioned that as well.
Just to add a point you made about housing costs, I think it's important for people who aren't involved in housing on a day-to-day basis. When I ran the housing department in Arizona, when we could fully fund with our trust fund and with homeless dollars and others, a housing project so that there was no debt whatsoever, and still, because of operations, because of services, you were in the hole as a developer and provider. And so that's where philanthropic dollars, other human service dollars, and other things come in. But I think it's important to realize that when you're serving that population at 30% of AMI and below, it's almost impossible to make, it is impossible, not almost impossible, to make a housing deal work without outside support. So
no, it truly is. And sometimes, a contract will have anticipated, and after 3 years, it goes away. And we need to go to philanthropy to say, okay, bridge us for a year till we get in our next game plan. And so we've been really grateful for, philanthropy, in those cases, help us cover the social workers for a year till we, figure out the next plan. And unfortunately, that's the name of the game. and the more people we help, the bigger we grow. We have allusions to that we want to end homelessness in all of our communities. But it also means that the fundraising take just keeps going higher and higher.
Pam, how about you in terms of public-private partnerships? What are some things you've seen along the way?
Were you directing that to me, Fred? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So, gosh, it's critical. The solutions to homelessness need to be owned by government, by private philanthropy, by the communities. One of the ways we kicked off the success of reducing overall homelessness, I didn't mention in my opening remarks that Governor McDonnell challenged us to reduce overall homelessness by 15% before the end of his administration without any new dollars. And we actually reduced it by 16%. But that was because we had everyone come to the table, and we had the Freddie Mac Foundation step up with private dollars that provided more flexibility to provide capacity building, technical assistance, and training. Many times federal dollars are so prescriptive and rigid that communities, organizations can't really address effectively the issues that they need to address. So the private dollar is so important. As Allison mentioned, it really is a puzzle to piece together all the different funding sources. And while I know that's very challenging, and Allison keeps us educated, as don't forget that what it takes for us to do this, the value of having different sources and different areas of ownership is that all your eggs aren't in one basket. So with the ebb and the flow of who's in the White House or who's in the governor's mansion, having that local philanthropy support really provides a lot of stable funding and support. As mentioned earlier, it's not just the money, it's having that political influence, local as well as statewide. We've seen a lot of communities struggle and turn to their state legislators to help share their story. And that really has influenced some of the new funding that's come from our General Assembly, has been the local stories that are coming out, showing that this is how we're reaching success, but we need more money. So it's the private public partnerships, I think, are critical.
Let me just say that while the $5 million grant from Community Foundation in Charlottesville was amazing, you don't have to give $5 million to make a difference. And so we would encourage philanthropy to be involved in whatever way they can, to the capacity building pieces, to other pieces, to the non-funding pieces, because again, I think it's critical. Kelly, how about you and public-private partnerships?
I think just to add and maybe highlight some things from Allison and Pam, I think the public sector allows us to go to scale, right? I mean, and there was a question in the chat earlier about guaranteed income. I've got to say, as a nonprofit, we wouldn't be able to make a difference. You wouldn't move the needle. It wouldn't be, there's some small things in, in Richmond with that, but federal programs can take solutions to scale, and they can provide a level of accountability that no other partners in these efforts can. That said, you need the private response to be nimble, to be flexible, as Pam said, and we have a higher tolerance for risk, for experimentation, for innovation. I once heard a funder describe philanthropy as the tugboat helping the government tanker shift directions, right? And so using like the role of philanthropy can nudge in the direction that we're trying to go, or to get started early. Like, we know it's coming, let's jump in now. We saw that in Richmond with rapid rehousing, a homeless service innovation. It was the Community Foundation of Richmond that helped us get started. And now it's like how we do business. It's in the federal funding package, but it was that early start that made a difference. And I think just, going back to, racial equity and the challenges facing us now, being able to go to scale with accountability, but being able to do it quickly and to be responsive, that's what helps us, become more just as a community. It helps us to be compassionate in a way that is measurably better for our neighbors and for our communities, right? And so it is that combination of doing things that matter over time, but being able to get started now. That's what I would say. Like, that's why this approach, a public-private approach, makes such a big difference.
Thanks. Yeah, your mention of the nonprofits being able to take on more risk, I would also say that's a role of philanthropy. The risk capital. And I know some of us have more tolerance for that. I worked for Kresge for a long time. They had a lot of tolerance for that, but.
Well, and yeah, I mean, I'll just say, like, the other thing, like cash flow, right? Like, it was actually Richmond Memorial Health Foundation that gave us bridge loans during the pandemic. We would not have been able to save lives without that. We were at relatively low risk, right, in the end, because we've been around for a while, but still that was critical. So.
Great. Well, we got time for one more question, I think, but I would just add two things to the public-private partnerships, just two things that I've been impressed by over the last few years, that partners we don't think about. One is academia. Notre Dame years ago created the South Bend Center for the Homeless in a partnership with Notre Dame University. And it gave an opportunity for student internships and volunteerism and this sort of thing, tied the two communities together that sometimes weren't always good partners with each other. But many of our communities have universities or colleges, and sometimes they have space. Sometimes there's just a variety of ways for that partnership. The other is that we haven't talked a lot about, and I've spent a good portion of the last 10 years working on, is the intersection of health and housing, and the role that the managed care organizations and hospitals and healthcare organizations generally can play as they become more. I mean, Allison probably knows more about this than I do, but in a number of places, hospitals have recognized the and managed care organizations have recognized how supportive housing can make a real difference for their populations. And so, again, the healthcare world, I think, is a place to look. So the last question is, before we open it up to everybody, is sort of what are the greatest opportunities for addressing homelessness you see in the coming year? I'll start with Pam. What do you think you see coming down the road that's an opportunity?
So interestingly enough, Fred, your comment about housing and health, I think, is an opportunity. We've been talking about it for many, many years about the intersection between housing and health. But it wasn't until the pandemic, when it really was driven home, that in order to stay healthy, you needed to have a home to go to. In order to do your schoolwork, you needed access to broadband, you needed a home. In order to work, for those that were lucky enough that could continue to work from their homes. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the service industry couldn't do that. So I think coming up in 2022, we have an opportunity to use what we've learned in the pandemic, because it impacted everybody. It's one level or another. Our legislators were impacted by it. How can we use lessons learned as an opportunity to drive home the fact that we need additional funds for affordable housing? We cannot move people from homelessness into housing without more affordable units. The sad fact is that when the moratorium on evictions was placed, not only across the country, but we actually had one here in Virginia before the the CDC stepped in, it kept people housed, which was great. The sad thing is that people being evicted open up units, and that's how many communities move people experiencing homelessness into housing. They are using the units that for people who were just evicted. So that's not the solution to the affordable housing crisis. It's not to evict more people, right? We need to create more housing, and it needs to be affordable, and it needs to come with supportive services for people who need them. Another opportunity is to really utilize some of the existing ARPA funds, the American Recovery Plan funds that are coming our way, to test out some new solutions. So Virginia's getting about $39 million in home ARP funds, which is coming through HUD, and it's really bringing together, creating new housing with homelessness. And DHCD will be conducting input sessions in January, February timeframe. And so we're going to be hearing from communities about what they need as it relates to these funds. So that's an opportunity for the foundations to work with their COCs and local planning groups to identify, okay, what are some of our biggest challenges here, and how can this pot of money or other pots of money could be used to really look at some long-term solutions. These funds came to us to deal with an emergency situation, but there's so much money that we can do a better job of identifying some long-term creative solutions.
Great. So it's about time to switch to questions from the audience. Or I just want to say two things. One is the other potential gold mine is the Build Back Better dollars. If they actually happen, we need to be prepared to use them well. It'll be more money than we've ever had to address some of these problems, and we need to be ready to sort of think how to use them wisely to address some of the things we wanted to address for a long time. The other things, just as a short commercial, which is for those of you who are interested in pursuing this in more detail from a philanthropic perspective, the Funders Together to End Homelessness is a national funders group that you ought to connect with. I was on the board for a long time. They have all kinds of resources. They have webinars and all kinds of other things that are going on. So if you're in philanthropy and want to pursue more you can get a lot of information from them. And so it's Funders Together to End Homelessness, and I encourage you to check them out online. So Susan or whoever, I guess it's Caroline.
Caroline.
You're gonna take it from here.
Oh, I think we've got two questions. I think the person who asked this had to log off, but I think it's a great question. It's from Andrew Brown. He said, I'm curious on how the rest of Virginia, lives in Northern Virginia, is addressing housing security with the help of guaranteed income programs.
Ooh, I mean, obviously, I would say it's a critical issue that we need to deal with. I'm not sure we're the right group of folks. If somebody else wants to jump in, fine. I don't have the. Oh, here's someone who's going to help us about right now, joining us with Allison. I'm sorry. I don't really have a response at this point. It's something that, you know, all communities need to be thinking about, but it's not something I'm deeply involved in at the moment. And I don't know if Pam or Kelly or Allison have anything.
There was a tiny pilot in Richmond, I think, led by, I mean, it's a public-private partnership with Robbins Foundation and the city of Richmond. But again, like it's not going to scale, and it's not serving our, you know, the people that we have in shelters currently. So.
Okay. I think Patty, you had a question.
Yeah, did you, I was just curious whether, I mean, what you all are anticipating as being either some of the positive changes or maybe the challenges with the new administration when it comes to some of the efforts that you've made, especially since the pandemic.
Well, that's a good question. I mean,
yeah.
Go ahead, Kelly.
Well, I mean, I'll just say two things. You know, I've had the privilege of serving on the Governor's Coordinating Council under 3 separate governors of both parties. And the thing about homelessness is that this can be a bipartisan issue. And there are elements of how we collectively, collaboratively respond using data, looking at costs, focused on outcomes. Those things can persist regardless of other issues. And like historically, homelessness can be a uniting issue in that way. I think, you know, I won't go too much more into that, although, you know, we'll see. But I think there's an opportunity for philanthropy to play here, and that is to hold the memories of what we've learned during the pandemic, right? I mean, I know in my community, funders called me like April 2020, like, Kelly, what do you need? How can we help? Because they recognized the urgency and the role that they had to play, and that was critical. And so as we navigate a new administration at the state level, I think for philanthropy to keep homelessness on the agenda, to can say this is a long-term approach to addressing a really complex issue, like it's, you know, 4 years in some ways is a long time, in some ways it's going to be a blink. And so I think that's a role that funders can play of really, you know, this is Fred's comment about the non-financial impact of like, these things take a long time to implement. And so for funders to, you know, say homelessness is important to us, we've seen how it made a difference, let's not stop or go backwards, like keep going forward. Some things will change. You know, I think, unfortunately, I think some of this centering racial equity will change. You know, but that doesn't mean that we're backing away as a community. So those are the roles I think funders and philanthropy can play, no matter what happens with the new administration.
And I would just add, and Pam and Allison, you both alluded to, I mean, and Kelly too, that one of the things I've seen at the federal level over the last 15 years or so is as programs were getting cut left and right, homelessness at least held its own, mainly because of the data-driven approach. Both sides of the aisle, as Kelly said, when you can come in and share, this is working, here's how we know, we've got the data, doesn't win everybody's, approval in this sort of fact-free world, but in many cases, that data-driven approach, the sort of proven practices has a significant impact. And again, a place where philanthropy can help local providers be able to collect that data and aggregate it. Oftentimes we find collecting data is the easy part. It's aggregating it and analyzing it that you don't have the resources for. So that's another area. Pam, you have some thoughts on this particular question?
So as Kelly mentioned, it was Governor McDonnell, a Republican, who kicked off this effort in 2010 he issued a housing policy framework that included addressing homelessness and empowered his senior economic advisor, Bob Sled, and then Secretary Dr. Bill Hazel to co-lead the Governor's Coordinating Council. And when Governor McAuliffe came on board, it was right on the heels when First Lady Michelle Obama announced the Mayor's Challenge to end veteran homelessness, and the governor jumped right on board with that. And then with Governor Northam, he also issued an executive order focused on preventing evictions and increasing permanent supportive housing. So, each governor has identified his own take on the issue. And, at DHCD, obviously being a state agency, we serve at the pleasure of the governor. And so our role is to provide that data, as has been mentioned, as to what's really impacting the reduction of homelessness, or if it's actually going up. The Governor-elect Youngkin is very interested in education. Having students in stable, affordable housing produces positive outcomes with education. And, economic development, it's all about having affordable housing. And in order to bring new companies to a state, you've got to have that. So, I think it's a matter of, with the incoming administration, wait and see what, who's in these pivotal roles, the secretariats, and then, begins the sharing with them what we've done in the past and what's been working. So.
I think that was the last of our questions.
Are there any other questions from the group that folks want to share before we wrap up? I just want to take a moment to acknowledge our incredible presenters who are on with us today. I think it bears mentioning that, always it's a big ask for our partners to give of their time, but I think the homeless services system in particular has worked incredibly hard across the state over the last 2 years to make sure that our most vulnerable neighbors have what they need to stay safe in this incredibly challenging time. And so I know the 4 of these folks have been working just incredibly hard on this issue, and we're incredibly fortunate to have such amazing resources and dedicated people in our community to tackle this really challenging issue. So Fred and Allison and Kelly and Pam, thank you so much for the work that you do and for being with us today. And thanks to everybody for joining us. I know, Patty, you're going to get a survey out to folks.
Yes, I thank you. I just want to also take a moment to thank Susan and Caroline for planning this event and leading us as these very capable co-chairs of this networking group.